So my name is Hillary Sweetman. I'm a PhD student at McGill, and I will be the chair for today's session. So throughout the session, if you have any technical issues or questions, please don't hesitate to send me a direct message on the Zoom chat, and I will be ready and waiting to help you out. Just before we get started, I have a couple of announcements. So the session you're here to see is regarding SciLearn, learning how to learn in STEM using neuroscience and a citizen science framework. The session is being recorded, so if you're not comfortable being on camera, please feel free to turn your camera off. And additionally, if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can also rename yourself so that your name is not visible. And finally, I have enabled our closed captions to be accessible to everyone, but if you find these to be distracting, you can switch them off by going to the little more option on the bottom of your screen with the ... and there's an option to toggle them on and off there at any time. So I believe that is all of my updates. There's still a couple of people coming in, but we would like to hear from our presenters. So let's just go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hillary.
And yeah, hands off. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'm just going to wait for our slides to come up. Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We're so thrilled to be here and to see so many of you and your faces. As Hillary said, no pressure to have your cameras on. We love to see your face, but please feel free to participate in the way that makes you feel most comfortable. As you can see, my name is Kira Smith. I'm from the Office of Science Education, and I'm here with my colleagues from the Office of Science Education. Maybe I'll ask them to give a little wave when I say their names. I have with me Armin, Christina, Cynthia, Janette, and Marcy is our director, who I think is joining us today, which is awesome. Everyone will introduce themselves in more detail later. So I'll leave that to them, and please bear with us. We'll ask you to introduce yourselves in the chat in just a second or two, maybe more than a second, more like 10 minutes, but we do look forward to meeting you in the chat. So today's session will follow this schedule. We'll start off with a brief introduction to the program. I'll be talking about the key features of SciLearn. As Hillary mentioned, that's the focus of our session today. Then we'll take you through a mini SciLearn module. You can really experience what our students have been experiencing for the past year. We'll have a brief discussion, we'll talk about our evaluation data, and then we'll have our after party, which is our very fun SciLearn specific, more O's specific now, our office specific part of the session that is very fun, as the name would suggest. So again, as Hillary mentioned, please feel free to rename yourselves if you'd like, with your pronouns, with anonymous, whatever you prefer. Please also feel free to make liberal use of the chat. We'll try to get to any questions that you have, but if we can't get to them in the chat themselves, then we'll bring them up at various points throughout the session. And if for any reason you need us to stop, if you can't see something properly, if somebody's audio is strange, please just go right ahead and interrupt. We want to make sure that you can fully participate, and if something is not allowing you to, then we want to know. As well, if you have any private accommodation requests, you're welcome to send them to me. And as well, as Hillary mentioned, she's at your disposal too. So to get started with a brief introduction to the program, let's talk about what motivates the program itself. So learning independently is challenging. Adjusting to university level learning is particularly challenging these days. I think this goes without saying. I'm not going to belabor the point. And SciLearn is rooted in the context of the pandemic, but I think everyone on our team would agree that it really stands the test of time, and we hope that for years to come, many students will find the program valuable. It's not just for pandemic, remote learning settings. It's for always. And some of these challenges arise because learning how to learn is not taught, and workshops are not personalized. Students often lack that, individualized attention, which is totally fair, in our large class settings at many of our institutions. As well, students have to adapt quickly to instructors' expectations that might vary greatly from those that their teachers had in CEGEP and in high school. And this can cause significant anxiety and reduced motivation. And while there are resources available to them, many of our institutions have great, student support resources. Offerings are not usually coordinated and students might not be aware of them. It's actually hard to take advantage of these resources. And they're also often co-curricular. So they also students might not recognize the importance of the resources themselves. So all of this culminates in a real need for learning how to learn. So next, moving on to our program itself and how we sort of meet the needs of students and we rise to these challenges. Some key features of the program. To start, SciLearn is a citizen science inspired project. So all of our students who participated in SciLearn embody the role of amateur scientists with the guidance of our facilitators, so many of my teammates who are here today. And these facilitators, my teammates, are experienced scientists themselves and science graduate students and education experts. So they received good support to explore the validity of various questionnaires, which covered learning strategies, metacognition, and mindset in the McGill context. Students completed a survey at the start of the program and one at the end of the program. And survey results will be discussed with you, and we also discuss them with the students themselves. Second, a learning community. This is one part of the program that is really near and dear to me. I'm the student engagement officer, so I probably have to care a lot about this, but I do anyways. So this was a real focus for us, and modules featured opportunities for students to interact and learn from one another in breakout rooms and during our after parties, as I mentioned. We also had celebratory end of program happy hours. They're welcome to have smoothies and water and lemonade or whatever they prefer. And students socialized. And we also had a few other events where we partnered with student groups around the focus of learning how to learn. As well, accessible and relevant neuroscience was a key feature of the program in that our facilitators drew on their expertise to relate learning strategies to neuroscientific concepts. You're going to experience this today. I'm super excited for you to hear from Christina in just a second, as soon as I'm done introducing the program. And next, self-awareness and personalizing learning was a real goal for us. As you know, I mentioned that workshops are often not particularly relevant to the individual learner. We really wanted to provide students with a variety of strategies to personalize their approach to learning and sort of develop their toolbox for the rest of their university career. And last, something that's also near and dear to me was the importance of healthy lifestyle habits. We talked a lot about the impact of sleep, exercise, meditation, and diet, and what those mean for learning. And it seems like a lot of students really found this valuable, which was really, really great. And if people don't intrinsically care about getting a lot of sleep or meditating or these things, I think the clear impact on their learning was enough to motivate many students to make real changes. So now for some specifics about the program. I've talked about it a bit abstractly. It is 5 modules, so 5 sessions every 2 weeks, an hour and a half on Zoom. We focus on planning, assessing, monitoring their own learning. We talked about the knowledge, skills, and attitudes required for learning. The goal is to succeed in first year and for the rest of their career. And we do stay in touch with students throughout their career. That's the goal. So we sort of form a community that will be in touch, and we invite all of our students to events, even if they're no longer currently in the program. And as I mentioned, it's inspired by a citizen science framework. So I've been talking a lot about citizen science. Some folks here may have heard of it before. Initially, it was conceived as a way to assist the needs and concerns of citizens, and it being a form of science that was developed and enacted by citizens themselves. This might sound similar to participatory action research for those of us who do qualitative research, but essentially citizen science is really the practice of public participation and collaboration in scientific research to increase scientific knowledge. So some projects that may look familiar to you are these on the screen there. If there are some that we're missing, feel free to write them in the chat if you know of other citizen science projects. So SciLearn is considered one, and that's a real part of our program that we're really excited to expand on and develop. So your first task for this afternoon, if you will indulge us, is to participate in this citizen science project, as many of our students do, and try out one of the instruments that we use in our sessions. So do this on behalf of your students. So we ask that you think there's a form in the chat. Oh, wonderful. eBird. Okay, sorry, I just saw that, Sean. Awesome. So we ask that you click on the link in the chat and fill out this form using the mindset of a first-year student. So harken back to, let's not say how many years, but however many years ago you were a first-year student, and try to fill out the survey with that mindset. So, it might be too challenging to go back to that. We'll discuss the results later. The survey shouldn't take too long, but the purpose really is for you to experience one of the instruments that we used in our citizen science project. So we'll give you some time now to do that. If you have any issues with the survey, with the form, please let us know in the chat or let me know. It shouldn't take too long. If you don't mind maybe giving us a thumbs up reaction on the bottom there when you're all done, just to let us know that we're good to move on. No rush, but please do let us know. Okay, so you're welcome to keep filling out the form as we speak, but I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Christina, to introduce herself and also walk you through a module.
Hi, yes, thank you, Kira. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're very excited to be here, very excited to speak with you today. And as Kira mentioned, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a mini SciLearn module. Now, as we talked about, the SciLearn module is about an hour and a half. We do not have an hour and a half, so we're not going to go through the entire thing. So I've picked and chose certain little aspects to give you an experience of what a SciLearn module really looks like for students. So with that in mind, I'm going to put on this little excited persona. I'm going to explain a little bit about the modules themselves so that you have an idea of what topics we cover. And then I'm going to go straight into one of them. So these are the 5 modules that we cover. They do cover more than what we say here, but these are kind of the overarching themes for each one of them. The first is self-awareness, in which students do kind of the same thing that you just did. We teach them about the importance of self-awareness, and we have them fill out the surveys that we mentioned earlier. So those on the LSI, which is the one that you're doing now, and some of you have already done, so thank you. Others like the metacognitive awareness inventory, we'll talk about this later, and the mindset kind of inventory as well. We'll talk about that as well. So that's the first module, just introducing the program, doing a little bit of that. The second one is talking about the concept of flow. So the scientific concept of flow, how to get into it, what it means, and how it can be used to improve workflow and how to improve productivity for students. So with that in mind, we talk about Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's flow model. We go into it and we discuss all the tips and tricks about it. Third one we talk about is memory, making it stick. So what is memory? How does it work? How can we use that knowledge, specifically that neuroscientific knowledge of how the brain works and how memory actually functions in order to improve or hack into our brains and improve our memory and thereby do better on exams, for example. 4, we talk about aha moments, so those beautiful moments where things make sense. We talk about the science of those moments, how they're created, how that seems to work. And we discuss the 2 kind of big modes of thought, which is kind of this focused and diffuse thinking. We talk about when to use each of them and what the real benefit is to be able to switch from one to the other depending on the context. And finally, we have a little pun there, minding our data. It's like minding our data because data mining. But minding our data is really the module that we go back to that citizen science framework and we have students go through their own data. We explain and kind of analyze it together. We go through each one of the inventories. We describe why we use that inventory, what the concept behind it is, what it looks like, how it works. Students analyzed their own data previously. Now they get to talk about it and see what the changes are between the first and second time that they did those surveys, that kind of thing. So it's very data heavy on that front. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm actually going to talk about the memory one specifically. So to give you an idea, here's our kind of first slide that we typically open with. So now I'm just going to pretend you're all students and kind of welcome you all, kind of like a John Oliver style welcome, welcome, welcome thing. And with that in mind, I wanted to get you all to introduce yourselves a little bit. So Kira mentioned this a little while ago. So it's been some time, but if you're happy to do that, please do write your name and your institution in the chat. And also if you drink coffee or tea in the morning, or at any time, I guess, if you're more of a coffee person or a tea person. We're not trying to separate you or anything, just something fun to get us started. That's all. Yeah, so I see there's a lot of discussion about the LSI. We'll talk about it a little bit more once we get to the data section of this presentation. So I'll hold off until then. Okay, yes, so welcome to SciLearn. Okay, next slide, please, Armin. Yeah, so if you have time, oh, perfect, perfect. A few of you are saying where you're from, whether you're a coffee or tea drinker, is perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about how memory works. And this is probably a good time for me to properly introduce myself as a neuroscientist. So I realized I didn't do that. I'm terrible at doing that. I graduated from McGill twice now, and my second degree was a master's degree in neuroscience, working in addiction specifically, but with a lot of interest in like the general workings of the brain, specifically how adolescent experiences affect long-term development. So learning and memory is very interesting to me personally. So with that in mind, I'm going to describe a little bit about how memory works, starting with that little website at the bottom of the page. Now, the brain.mcgill.ca is a really interesting, kind of remarkable, and one of those gems that you find on the internet, one of those remarkable little websites where, funded by the Montreal Neurological Institute, by the MNI, it basically describes different aspects of neuroscience that individuals might be interested in. And what it does remarkably well is that it describes those concepts and aspects in 3 different ways. And by that, I mean in 3 different levels of complexity. The first being for a beginner, so kind of more overarching with basic concepts and more metaphors, that kind of thing, an intermediate version, and an advanced version. And it is the same concept, they're all correct, but they do include different types of detail. So I highly recommend you check it out if you're ever interested in neuroscientific concepts. Okay, so I want to start by saying right at the top of that little diagram that we have there, you have eyes, ears, and touch. So imagine that you're sitting in a lecture hall and you're trying to listen to your professor, you're watching them, or perhaps you're just, still on Zoom because we're still in this world and we're all in tiny little cubes. You're watching your professor, you're watching the slides, and you're trying to get some information from that. You're also listening to your professor. They're talking about who knows what, and you're trying to remember as much as you can because you're about to get tested on this. So you want to try and see how much of what they're telling you you can actually recall later when it's necessary and it impacts your grade. And finally, there could be tactile things like, for example, doing a lab or a CPR training or some kind of welding or some kind of trade, something like that, where the actual tactile aspect is very important as well. So you're trying to learn from touch. Now, the sensation itself happens kind of independently from anything else. You don't need to think about sensing anything. That happens automatically. But to be able to actually perceive it, so that first step of perception, that's when your brain gets involved. So that's the first time that signals get sent up to your brain and you start to actually sense something. Up until then, it's all kind of in your peripheries and it's happening, like I said, without any kind of central nervous system involvement, any kind of brain, spinal cord involvement right away. That sensory memory is only a couple seconds long. It's very, very short. So it's the things that, that's why you forget that your clothing is on you after a certain amount of time. That's why certain things stop bothering you, like light, for example. After a certain amount of time, it stops to bother you. If it's more or less than it was a few minutes prior, you don't really realize it anymore. That's where that comes from. But if you pay attention, you can get into that working memory. Now, this is kind of the memory that most individuals have in mind when you think about memory. And this is the memory that you have when you're actually actively working through something. So when you're taking information and you're actively working with it in that moment. So what I'm doing right now and what you're doing right now, trying to remember everything I just told you for the past couple of minutes, that's about the time frame for working memory. Now, to get from sensory memory, just about everything gets forgotten in sensory memory. So the only way to actually take that information, keep it in mind in that working memory is really through attention. And attention is something that is consciously controlled. Up until this point, we haven't had much conscious control, but that's where you have some conscious control. Now, unfortunately, and this is a little bit sad, the attention span of a given adult now seems to be around 20 minutes. So it can get saturated really, really easily and very quickly. So when it comes to just straight up paying attention for a long period of time, it's very difficult to do that. So there are obviously ways in which we can do that a little bit better and how we can, as individuals, break up things that we're listening to, break up certain information that is coming to us in order to make sure that we can remember and work with it later on. again, a lot of the working memory, a lot of the things that we're thinking about at a given time, we also forget. And I'll talk about forgetting in a second. Now, moving down a little bit more, this is kind of the long-term memory. So this is the memory that I also think a lot of individuals have in their minds when it comes to thinking of the concept of memory. So the thing that you learned a long time ago, now you're able to remember it, recall it, and use it. That kind of thing is what oftentimes I think is referred to as memory. Now this can last days, it can last a whole lifetime, and this particular type of memory is really less understood in terms of the colloquial way of thinking about it than I think people tend to think that they understand it. It's a weird way of saying it, but what I mean to say is oftentimes, so the memory itself, the memories themselves are stored all over the brain. And it's less so that you forget a memory, it's more that you forget the path to retrieve it. So the information is still stored somewhere, you just have no idea how to get there, which is equivalent to losing it altogether, isn't it? So if you have your keys and you lose your keys and you can't find your keys, whether they exist or not, it's kind of irrelevant. The point is that you don't have your keys. So the neuroscience there is very interesting and fascinating, but really we're talking about what it takes to get to that long-term memory. So now I'm going to get to this forgetting aspect. We all forget. On the contrary, it is the best thing about us. If we remembered everything about everything, life would be miserable. You'd remember all of your sensations that you ever had, and you wouldn't be able to move on from things as easily as we can. Not that we move on from things very easily anyways, but you know what I mean. So it's very important that we forget as part of our evolutionary basis to keep learning. We learn from certain things and we forget certain things that aren't really all that important for us to know in the first place. But learning how we forget, which is a very predictable pattern we've known for quite some time, since the 1800s, that can help us better hack into this working memory to long-term memory transduction there, that aspect, and move things into our long-term memory so we can actually recall them later on. Now, the way to do that with sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory, really the best way to do that is always repetition. So repetition is really the best way for us to do anything, because the way that you're keeping it in this loop is by bringing it back into the loop constantly. And by it, I mean information, any information. So whether you're at a party and you're trying to remember this person's name who's very attractive, and you're like, I should remember their name, I should remember their phone number, I should remember this random thing about them to impress them later on, and you're constantly talking about it in your own head, trying to recall it. That's what you're doing there. Now, there's a way to do that even more deliberately, which is called deliberate practice. And we use the Michael Jordan example here. And this is that idea of constantly practicing, but it's not just the practice itself. It's how well you practice that changes how well you learn. So deliberate practice and just the act of practicing isn't enough. It's practicing well. So Michael Jordan, for example, if you're talking about shooting basketball, if you shoot a basketball every single day for 5 hours a day, but you have no good technique, nobody's teaching you, nobody's coaching you, you could just learn to shoot very well, very badly. Like you could learn to shoot in the same way every single time, but the way that you'd learn would be terrible. However, if you have that good practice, you can get to the point where you're an expert and you get to that muscle memory. You create a muscle memory to shoot almost perfectly every single time. And the less you think about it at that point, the better your performance is. That's usually what happens with professional athletes. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. And then we'll talk about the forgetting curve. So the other half of this little diagram here, and the importance of sleep and how on the neuroscience level that works. Let me just talk a little bit about the brain before we get into really complicated things. Okay, so a little bit about the neuroscience of memory. Now, I'm not going to go too much into details. There's a lot of different things, and the brain is super complicated, but I want you to focus on two little structures in that brain right there. The first one is that little blue structure called the amygdala, and the second one is slightly to the right of that called the hippocampus. It's kind of purpley something something. So you've probably heard of both. They're quite famous colloquially. They're well known. And they serve different functions, even though they're both kind of involved in memory in different ways. So the amygdala specifically, I think a good way to remember it is that it's involved in emotional processing, and particularly fear or threat processing. So being able to take anything that you see, anything that you hear, and goes through there and sees, okay, is there a threat here? Is there something I should be afraid of? What are my emotions at that point? And then you'll see in a second why I'm bringing up the amygdala. Let's move on to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is fascinating in that originally we thought all the memories themselves were stored in the hippocampus, And that seems to be true for some of them, particularly for newer memories, as they're moving to final resting places somewhere else in the cortex, somewhere else in the brain. So that actual area seems to be where memory is encoded, particularly as you get closer to the amygdala, that kind of middle part, that's where really they seem to be encoded. So if you remove that from the brain, individuals really can't make new memories. So we know that there's something about that. Obviously, there's quite a bit more work there that we can talk about later, but there's something about that in which all of the information that goes through there can be encoded, and specifically in that area, that's where that encoding is happening. And then it moves on to other areas in order to be stored long-term. Okay, so we talked about a couple of these areas. Now I wanted to show you this little digitized video style thing showing how all of these areas are connected. So the brain itself is remarkable, but it's mostly, hopefully it works. I don't know. If it doesn't, you'll see the idea behind it. It's just a bunch of lines showing, yeah, that's okay. That's okay. It's just a bunch of lines showing connections between different areas of the brain. This is really interesting because you get to see how different areas are connected. Each of the areas is something completely different or different. But in order to bring the sensation, or rather the general everyday being of thought and consciousness, they all have to work together. So you'll see that they're all connected in specific ways, and certain connections are very important to showing how memory works and how certain things can be retrieved. So like I said, if you don't have that connection to the point at which a piece of memory, a bit of information is stored, it's not really very useful. So those connections are incredibly important. And oftentimes these connections can be changed based on things like, oh, I don't know, sleep, forgetting. So this is where we're going into that aspect of things. So you can just go to the next slide there, Armin, please. Perfect, yeah. So the importance of sleep. Now, in terms of how memory is stored, there's still a couple different theories of specifically where information is stored and how. One of them is in that connection theory. So being sure that the information itself is in those connections and in how these new connections are being formed and how that information is being transferred. So this is one of those scientific studies, speaking of like citizen science, trying to explain a little bit more science and using that scientific knowledge to our benefit as learners. This is one of those studies where what I really want to focus on are these kinds of lines with a bunch of dots on them. Seems kind of interesting, but you don't really know what they are. So on the small level, so we're talking about the big level, how these memories are kind of working, how the brain is functioning all together to bring all this information. On the small level, how does that work on, the individual neuron or brain cell level? So cells talk to each other all the time, and they have these long processes called axons, and called axons to be able to communicate with those cells around them. And these axons have little tiny bulbs on them that have synapses, and synapses are really the chemical kind of areas in which those communications happen. So you'll see all these little bulbs, and you can see that there's lots of them. There's always lots of them. They're constantly in contact with each other, and they change all the time. Whether that's because you're learning something new, or maybe something happened and you don't have enough of a given molecule in the brain, or you have too much of it, so you just have connections all over the place. This is where drugs get very interesting as well, drugs of abuse specifically. So what they do in this particular study is they can try to teach rats to do a certain thing. In this case, it's a rotor rod. So they try to teach them to go on a spinning rod. And the point is that, there's a certain amount of these connections in the cells that they're interested in. And once you train, you learn some things, you have more connections. But what's interesting about sleep specifically is that sleep can actually strengthen those connections, improve them and strengthen them. So if we take this from this study, of course, this is done in basic science, but the concepts transfer. So if we take this idea and we go from, okay, it's important that we train, but it's important that we sleep, that we give time for those connections to form in a way that's not conscious, in a way that's not us pushing for it. I'm sure you can see where I'm going here. So studying overnight, for example, versus actually sleeping, the second one is probably the way to go. And I think most of us who have tried an all-nighter and pulled an all-nighter and then had an exam the next day would agree that you're not really at your best during that exam, and that could have some detrimental effects for your future. If it's an important exam, especially like an MCAT or an LSAT or a GRE, it could really impact you, even if you actually know this information. And the reason for that is that you didn't really provide the kind of atmosphere in the brain for those connections to really be formed. On the contrary, you're exhausted and they're only part way to forming and everything's all over the place and the brain just needed some time to organize itself. Okay, so with that, I wanted to talk about this, go back to the idea of forgetting. Forgetting is really important and we often think of it as a negative thing. And that, I'm going to try to convince you it's not a negative thing, or rather, I'm going to say, if we want to remember something, there are ways in which we can kind of counteract the very typical way in which we forget, which, like I said, was originally discovered in the 1800s, to use that to our advantage, really. So here on this graph, I'm showing you when you first learn something, you know it at 100%. I just told you something, you have it in your working memory, you know it right now. If I ask you in a day, you'll remember about 80% of it. If I ask you in 2 days, you'll remember about 70% of it, a little bit less. If I ask you in 3 days, you'll remember about 60% of it. And you can see that that slope, how quickly that line is going down, is quite steep. It's happening very, very quickly. Whereas if on the first day, you review it, you go back to that concept and you think about it again, you bring it back into your working memory and you're constructing more connections essentially at that time, whether with other concepts that you know, you're just bringing it up and thinking about it. Now you're back at 100%, you have this concept in your mind, in your working memory, and now you lose it over time. But as you can see, a little bit more slowly, that slope is less steep. Now, same idea if I review, a few days later, 2 days later, and you keep doing that, you can see that each time that slope is getting lower. Now, what does that mean? What does that actually functionally mean for you? If that slope is less steep, you're remembering more. So the more that you remember, the more likely you are to recall it later on an exam, for example. Now, there are ways to do this manually. You can remind yourself to study certain parts of your course at a certain time, right? Certain parts of the course, or teach certain parts of a course at a certain time, and go over certain information at a certain time. You can do this manually. You can decide for yourself what the elapsed time would be for you, what works best for you. But now we have the technology to implement this in apps, for example. So like things like Quizlet, a lot of flashcard apps, Anki, those kind of do this work for us. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you, are there any memory apps that you've used as a student, that you are using as a student, or that you hope your students are using, or your students are using? So if you could just write them in the chat. I've just listed a bunch of them here. We have data from a previous time that we've used these slides, so you'll see that students are all over the place. I want to kind of see from you, as participants here with us, what memory apps have you used, if any? So just please write that in the chat when you get a chance, if at all. None, that's okay. You don't have to use them. It's more of a point of curiosity, because like I said, it's a way to almost hack your brain without having to do it completely yourself. A little bit of help. Okay. Oh, perfect. Anki and Quizlet. Quizlet, I love Quizlet as well. Other than my electronic calendar. Nice. That's always good. Perfect. Yeah, those reminders and calendars are magical, aren't they? Okay, so one of the last things I want to go over before moving on to other parts of this presentation is this lovely slide on the illusions of competence. And I love this slide because I think it really outlines things that we all, before we learn a little bit more about the science of learning and specifically the neuroscience of learning, these are things that easily take us awry. Like, for example, we think that if we've read over our notes for a certain amount of time, a certain amount of repetition, we now know everything that's in those notes. But really what we've done is just this passive reading, right? So repeatedly reading your notes or textbook, or like glancing at a solution without actually working through the solution, often makes you feel like you know the information a lot better than you really do if you're tested on it. So that's part of the second one as well, passive rereading rather than active recall. So passively rereading, you're going, oh yes, I recognize that. You're almost testing your recognition, but you're not actually testing your recall. So you go, yes, I recognize that. This makes sense. This is a concept I've seen before, a word I've seen before. But then if I ask you to spell the word, completely different thing. You may not be able to do it even if you stared at it for some time. multitasking. Now, we're all kind of multitaskers at this point. I think we kind of have to be, oftentimes, unfortunately, given the world that we live in and all of the notifications that we're constantly bombarded with, whether they're social media or emails or chats or whatever they might be. It's very, very difficult. Yes, me multitasking by reading the chat as I'm presenting. Exactly, terrible example, but we do it all the time. And multitasking, specifically during learning, is really, really difficult. And it's problematic because our brain only has so much capacity at a given time. Like I said, we only have so much attention at a given time. So if we're using that resource, that very precious resource, to focus on multiple things, switching from one to the other is actually really costly. So instead of being able to remember something specific and keep working on that, keep repeating that thing, now our attention, which like I said is a scarce resource, we're using it all over the place, and then we're getting bits and pieces of a whole bunch of different things, and mistakes happen and you lose ideas, and at the end of the day, you're really not working as productively or remembering things as well as you could be. And finally, working through homework problems with others, but not on your own. This is also something that I think we're all guilty of, whether it's homework problems or group projects or something else, or presenting, for Pete's sake. You hear someone presenting something, you go, I can do that. And then you have to present it. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, I cannot do that. I did not remember all of the stuff that they said or that I even wanted to say. So you often kind of socially loaf at that point, which essentially means that you're not spending the time and the effort to go through it all yourself. And therefore you feel like you know things better, similar to that passive reading, than you actually do. So these are things that we need to keep an eye on as we're trying to learn and as we're trying to become better learners, using the information that we just learned for how memory works and how forgetting works. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you a little break. And I want you to, there's not too many of us. I'm going to ask you to use the chat and just go with A, B, C, or D, and just literally type in that letter in the chat for your vote. And we can do any one of these. We've done this, as you can see, students constantly vote for, or rather students are allowed to vote for whatever they please at that time. Okay. And Cynthia and I are going to try and tabulate these votes. Oh, we're almost tied, but I think C's are winning. Oh. All right. We're getting close. Hey, Cynthia, how are you counting this? Somebody voted 3 times.
7 D, 4 C, and 1 B so far.
All right.
Somebody can check that later.
Okay. All right. Yeah, you can't have multiple vote. No, bad. No, I'm kidding. Okay, and a few Bs. All right, I think the Ds have it. Yes, I think the Ds have it. So in that case, we're gonna watch a few minutes of a funny fails video to give ourselves a little break from all of the learning that we just did.
Oh my God! Are you okay? Ja, Mann, das ist ein iPhone, das kaputt geht. Yes, you're a queen. You must maintain. Did you really just do that? Oh my. You ready?
Well, I hope you enjoyed those, and thank you for bearing with me for mini SciLearn. I hope you enjoyed that as well. And now we're gonna, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask at this point, and then I'm gonna pass it on to my colleague Janette for a little discussion.
Hello, I'm Janette Barrington. I'm an educational researcher at OSE, and I recognize some of the names in the chat here. So hi to those of you from Concordia that I know from a long time ago. Now we're going to have a little discussion. I see some questions that we haven't got to yet in the chat. One in particular about higher order learning. Is from what we've understood, all of these neuroscience findings are really pointing to higher order learning. That is the big goal. So for sure, that's what they're perfectly valid for those higher order goals as well. Now, what we have is a Jamboard activity. If you go to the next slide. So we have two questions, and I'm very conscious of time because I want Armin to have time to get through some of the findings that we have from actually doing research on SciLearn. So we're going to post in chat a link to the Jamboard, and these are the two questions that we want, and you go to the link if you haven't used Jamboard before, and you can choose a sticky note and post comments on that Jamboard, and I'm going to be over at the Jamboard with you. And so really what we're asking is, you've just heard a little bit about memory. You might not have thought before about whether you actually teach with memory in mind, but maybe you do. Maybe you have formative assessments and little quizzes that actually space the learning so that memory is enhanced in your courses. So we'd like some concrete examples of those if you're doing that. And also with the spaced study, again, maybe you have study sessions in your class and have students actually engaging in study groups so that you're actually encouraging in class time some of the things that you'd like students to be doing outside of class time. And when we think also of the science of learning, we're thinking of active learning. I think most of you attending are engaging in active learning. So what kind of active learning are you doing? And also in terms of higher order learning, what kind of practice do you give students? Do you give practice with feedback? And so let's just have a few examples. We'll take just like a few more minutes to see what kind of example. Yeah, exactly. So we've got game show. So that's a great way of just getting students back into the content on a regular basis and not doing one lecture and then just moving on to the next one, but actually bringing back things that you've done previously outside of an official review for a test, for example. And then there may be some low stakes writing examples as well, what they call a brain dump, trying to get students to think about something just off the cuff, bring it back into memory before maybe a new lecture starts. Yeah, so we've got some great examples here. Oh, I don't know this. ISLE, Investigative Science Learning Environment. I'll check that out afterwards. That sounds very interesting. Student dialogue, having students just turn to their partner, just a quick think, pair, share. Oh, I'm sorry, for those of you who have just this, the sticky note is, there's a little bar menu on the left-hand side. One of them has a little page turned up and it's a sticky note. group projects, be speaking about their group projects as a way of actually revising at the same time some critical things for an exam, perhaps. Thank you, Cynthia. It's this fourth icon in the sidebar. Breaking up some really complex tasks over time as well is another good example. So the reason for doing the Jamboard is so that we actually have some examples here for ourselves for the next time, but also for you to learn from each other. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to move on to Armin's piece for the evaluation piece. We've got 15 minutes left and we want to get to the after party as well. So these are all great examples. Thank you for engaging in the discussion. Armin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Janette. Hi everyone, my name is Armin and I'm an educational developer with the Office of Science Education. I see some familiar faces, so welcome to this session. Thank you for being here. And I'll try to go a little bit more quickly through this section because I do also want my colleague Cynthia to have some time for the after party, which we think is one of the most fun parts of SciLearn. So I will stay after the session. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer then. So I just wanted to share with you some of the evaluation data that we've collected. This being a citizen science framework, as Kira mentioned, we have quite a lot of data that has been collected and we do have a report. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the attendance in these sessions that you might be interested in. So we have the fall section here on the left and we have the winter session. We are tracking both synchronous and asynchronous participation. So synchronous is when they are joining us live during one of our Zoom sessions and completing the activities online. Whereas the asynchronous is when they go onto My Courses, which is our learning management system, and they watch the recordings and they'll do the activities on their own time. And as you can see, most people have been participating in SciLearn synchronously. We had about 60 people in the fall 2020, and we've had 42 people in winter. These are people who've attended at least 3 sessions out of the 5 sessions that we've had. So it's important to mention. And at the bottom, what you'll see is that we've had some people drop off, and that's consistently happening between the fall and the winter session. So we are trying to change this trajectory. This is our baseline from our 2020 and 2021 experience, but we are trying to experiment with different ways to make sure that that line stays flat or even increases. But one thing that you'll see interesting here is that the asynchronous participation in the winter 2021 is more or less stable. So while we have a decrease in our synchronous participation, the asynchronous people in winter 2021 were stable. So I'm just going to pause the recording just for a second. Program. We've asked our participants if they found the program was valuable, and students either strongly agreed or agreed that the program was valuable, and also indicated that they're planning to implement something that they've learned in the SciLearn program in their future studies. So that's our overall evaluation data. In terms of our objectives, these are the objectives that we've set for ourselves at the beginning of the program, sort of like the learning outcomes for SciLearn. And as you can see, most students either strongly agree or agree that they've had fun as a result of these 5 modules and the other components of SciLearn. They've learned how the brain works, so either strongly agree or agree, most of them did. They've had a chance to experience science and how science actually operates in the real world. Also they've had a chance to build up their CV and get some experience and also improve their grades. So this was really, encouraging to see that we are meeting our objectives that we have set up at the beginning of the program. One other thing that, so we've presented quite a lot of neuroscience information in hopes of convincing them that, sleep is, for example, important, and having a good diet improves their GPA. And whatever we present, we try to correlate this with GPA, because we think that that's the one factor that they really are interested in. So for example, we present studies that indicate that if they're getting a better sleep, they will end up with a higher GPA, or if they start meditating, that improves their GPA. And as a result of this, it's very encouraging to see that we are starting to see some lifestyle changes that they're making. So for example, as a result of this program, we think they're getting more or better sleep, their diet might be improving, they're starting to meditate, they're starting to get more exercise, and this is aerobic exercise, which is great for the brain, and having more intentional leisure time, especially in the context of remote learning. So this was something that we were all really happy about, and to a certain extent unexpected, because we are giving them a chance to talk about what's of interest to them. And for example, they indicated diet, so we included a quick module about diet, and we did see an improvement in the diet, which is really wonderful to see. So I'm going to present some of the data that we have from those 3 instruments that we've been using, the pre-survey and our post-survey, to see the changes in terms of their metacognition and learning strategies. So I'll talk about 3 instruments really quickly. The first one is called the Learning Strategies Inventory. This is something that Sandra McGuire uses. This is 11 questions, and you've all done this, and I'll comment on your scores in a second. But what's interesting here is that this instrument is actually correlated with grades in undergraduate STEM courses, and I'll talk about that again in a second. There's a metacognitive awareness inventory, which is much more comprehensive. This is 52 questions, and we're still trying to understand this. This is broken down into both the knowledge of metacognition and the regulation of metacognition. And we're, again, seeing changes from pre to post when the students are going through these 5 modules. And lastly, there's the mindset quiz, which is a questionnaire based on Carol Dweck's work. And this would indicate if they have a fixed mindset, or if they have a growth mindset, or they have a strong growth mindset. So I'll comment on the results of that as well. But I just wanted to give you a sense of these instruments and where they're from. So the first one that I think is the most exciting for us is the Learning Strategies Inventory. So we are correlating their scores from pre, which is the first module where we get these numbers. We asked them to do the questionnaire similar to the one that you did. And the post is done at the 4th module. And we present this information to the students and get their feedback on the 5th module. So you can see that there are changes, but this was not significant in the fall 2020 session of SciLearn, whereas in the winter 2021 session, there was a statistically significant increase in the pre versus post scores of the Learning Strategies Inventory. And what does this mean? So the scores here have been correlated in other institutions with the predicted grades. So as you can see, our average is close to between 6.5 to about 7, and that is correlated to a predicted grade term GPA of about a B. So that's interesting. In fact, we've asked them to predict their own grades in SciLearn, and what we saw is that most of them are predicting that they will end up with an A or B. And because this is a longitudinal study, we'll have a chance to follow up to actually validate this in our own local context to see if this study actually holds true for McGill undergraduate students in science. So this was really promising to see. I'll talk about another one, which is the Metacognitive Awareness Inventory. Oh, sorry, just before moving on, Cynthia has been working behind the scenes here to calculate your own scores from the Learning Strategies Inventory that you've done. So the score that you have, the average score is about 5.2. So that is correlated to roughly about a C. Luckily, our SciLearners are doing a little bit better in their post score. So I'll talk about the Metacognitive Awareness Inventory, and this is divided into the knowledge of cognition and the regulation of cognition score, and we are seeing a very small trend towards an increase in their scores. This is again a very comprehensive questionnaire, so we have things that are being measured like declarative knowledge, procedural and conditional knowledge, as well as the regulation of cognition, which is really your ability to plan, manage information, monitor, evaluate, and debugging strategies. So there seems to be a trend towards an increase in these scores, even with 5 modules that we're presenting, which is really not much when you think about it. Most of this content that we are presenting is based on Barbara Oakley's work, and our idea is that we're trying to see what is the right combination of scores to get an increase in the pre versus post scores on these instruments. So, this is really helping us to see if the students are succeeding or not. For the mindset, their pre-scores, both for the fall and winter sessions are quite high. So most of our students actually come in with a growth mindset, and some studies have shown that this is really particularly powerful for students who might come in with a more fixed or a strongly fixed mindset. You do have quite a lot of potential if you present the content, but if students are coming in with a growth mindset, there might not be a huge increase or any change, and that's what we are seeing. We are more careful about evaluating this data. So there might be a student who comes in with a growth mindset or a fixed or a strong growth mindset, but they might be fixed on one of the categories. So there's still room for growth for even the students who are coming in with a growth mindset, and we're trying to use that to our advantage. So for mindset, we didn't really see a change. I just also wanted to comment on the fact that we have plans going forward to, make this into a more effective learning community. We know that a lot of the students that are coming in are not doing group study, for example, or group work, but we are trying to convince them of the value of group work. And Fresca is this learning community that we have, and we are planning to, integrate SciLearn and Fresca a little bit more going forward. So most of the students had not heard of Fresca. Fresca is this place that they come, it's like almost a one-stop shop where they can go and get help for their chemistry course and physics course and biology course all in the same space. So it's almost like a lab for SciLearn. Now we can actually see how the strategies that we've been passing on to them are being used in the context of Fresca. So we do have plans to make this more synergetic with Fresca, and that's one of our plans for the future. But SciLearn is a learning community, and we have tried to convince students of the value of group work in some of our content. I'll pass it off to Cynthia. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Armin. Okay, so for the remaining time in our session, we're actually going to treat it as what we usually call the after party, which typically would come after the scheduled time that we have. So typically our sessions are 1.5 hours long, and then we actually, oh, I feel like I froze. Okay, am I back? Okay, I'm going to repeat all of that because I actually have no idea what got across. So yeah, this is just the after party. It's usually much more informal, and we typically save it for actually after the entire session. So if we have a 1.5 hour session, that's actually all the content that we plan for SciLearn. And this is all like optional stuff that students can stay for the half hour after each module. And we find that we have a huge amount of students staying because somehow I think the informal and more like chat atmosphere is a little bit easier to engage in, and it's a good opportunity for students who might not have a ton of social interaction this year with everything being online. So we thought we would replicate this with you. We have a couple questions for discussion. Here are kind of the thoughts that we wanted to bring to you. Should SciLearn be a mandatory course, and or whose responsibility is the teaching of the science of learning? That's something we're thinking about. We'd love to chat more about with you. Could SciLearn or something similar be replicated at your institution? So some sort of program to teach students how to learn. And finally, what other kinds of information or data or insights that maybe we didn't get to in as much detail today would you be interested in hearing more about? So tied into that is also if you have any questions for us. I saw some things coming in the chat as we were presenting, and I tried to get to some of it, and if anything wasn't clear, this is really the time to just raise your hand and unmute and ask us. So typically we actually stop sharing the screen because it's just a bit nicer to see faces. So if you're around and you want to open up your video and see some faces. It would be a great time. No pressure if your internet can't handle it or if you just really aren't feeling it today. And I will also put some of those questions in the chat in case you want to refer back to them. And if anyone does have something to say, feel free to raise your hand. So you can just go into the reactions and click raise hand, and then, yeah, it can be in response to any of these 3 questions or something else that you wanted to talk about.
I'm happy to chime in. So hi, everyone. I'm Dave. I'm an instructor at McGill, but also a pedagogical counselor at Vanier College. You might know this, both pre-university programs, sciences and social sciences, are going under major revisions. Interestingly, in social science, there's a new methodologies competency that's supposed to be like a welcome to CEGEP. This is what the demands of being a student are here in the social sciences, and it's going to include a lot of things. And I think some of those things should be similar to what you are doing in your program. So I will definitely bring that up during our revision process.
Cool, thanks so much for sharing that. It's always really exciting to hear about what's going on in other departments and institutions too. I see, is it Yana, your hand's up?
Yes, here we go. I'm just wondering, I guess I was drawn to this session by the word citizen science, and I'm wondering whether anyone in the session uses citizen science or incorporates it into their teaching, and I'd love to know how they do it, because that's one of the things I was hoping to get out of it. Not that all the stuff that you talked about is, I mean, it's extremely useful. Unless the students know how to learn, no matter what we say, it's not going to be retained. But I was wondering about that citizen science aspect. And I mean, people mentioned PlantWatch and eBird, and I thought, are they actually using it, incorporating it? I'd love to know how they do it so that I could try something like that.
Got it. And yeah, I saw your comment in the chat. I'm sorry for like the misunderstanding. Yeah, I think to clarify kind of the citizen science framework that we have, and then Janette, feel free to chime in as well. But basically, I think what was inspired by citizen science is this idea that students who are in this program are able to collect their own data by doing the surveys that we have. So for example, the LSI is one of the instruments we use. We also had other kinds of surveys that you saw that Armin presented. And then through the program, they learn the skills, and they learn, it's basically like understanding their own learning, such that by the end, we actually go through their data and they're understanding it with us together. So they're both the, we call them co-investigators. So they're both the participants and also the researchers of the educational science that's happening in the program. So that's kind of the citizen science component. It's not so much, I guess, like promoting other citizen science projects like eBird or PlantWatch, but that's definitely, I think, where the inspiration comes from. And Janette, if you wanted to chime in on that.
Well, it is an ambition of ours to have like a dedicated website, like some of these other citizen science projects, where students could actually enter maybe between modules when they are actually engaging in some of these science of learning habits that we're trying to promote. So that's like a longer term goal, but they are getting, I feel, a sense of metacognition from it, of actually becoming more aware of how they are performing. And then over time, this is going to be compared with their cohorts from one year to the next. So that, I think there's going to be more excitement on the longitudinal side of this project. Maybe Armin has got something else there to say.
That was the point I wanted to mention, Janette, the fact that we are planning this to be a longitudinal study. So you described it perfectly. Thank you.
And I see Madoka's hand, and then Ahmed.
Quick comment on citizen science thing. I don't know how the researchers are usually done in this particular kind of study. So, but doesn't that like a skew bias, because it doesn't that bias the data? That's just the fact that they're signing up. So, anyways, just a comment. But I was going back in as 3 topics, so can I chime on, because it was great that we heard the docent was doing something like that. I mean, I think it's great that it could be mandatory, but at the same time, we don't want to duplicate effort. And I think I have it's sort of like it's not completely related, but we have the education for the plagiarism, and it's duplicated everywhere, and it sort of loses the point of the whole thing. So I think in that sense, this shouldn't be mandatory, but at the same time, those students who are struggling, it's more like a targeted approach. Maybe that if somebody is struggling below this, the university standard, then they should be mandatory.
Yeah, I think I have a response to that. I don't know if anyone else on the team wants to jump in as well. But on the topic of whether it's biased, yeah, I think totally, like, the students who might choose to sign up for SciLearn have, demonstrated an interest, hopefully, in participating in this program and learning. But I also think that one of the things, hopefully, that can kind of benchmark our progress is that we have them do a pre-survey and a post-survey, right? So at the beginning of the program, we see based on who they are as students and like where their learning and skills are already. And then during the course of the program, obviously they're like learning things through SciLearn, but there might also be other things in their lives, right? It's 10 weeks and it's a whole semester, and maybe they're in all sorts of other things. But by the end of the term, any differences that we can see, we can at least say it seems to be a little bit different than where it was 10 weeks ago. So that's one of the things. And then on the mandatory component, yeah, I think it would be a good point to not want to duplicate other programs or efforts in this that already exist. My understanding is that for SciLearn, like, it really came out of a gap. Like, I didn't really know of a lot of other programs that that kind of address, the science of learning for students, like for the learner. I think it's often just kind of expected you learn the content. So at least I think we haven't received complaints that it's been redundant, but I'd be really curious to hear more about like other programs that maybe are doing similar work.
The goal also is to have more integration with actual course content over time. And this year we're integrating with the orientation session for new students. So in that sense, we're trying to be very Faculty of Science specific. And we know that these kind of workshops are not being held.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Ahmed, is your hand up too?
Yes. I have been always participating in these kinds of conference or whatever it is, workshop. And it is always talking about the professors, the teachers, how do we do better? Now, the thing is that what about the students? The students, in my class, I asked them, okay, who likes this subject? And out of 150, nobody raises their hand. So it means that one professor has to persuade and just make it interesting for students to like the course because they have the course because they have to. I mean, otherwise, if it was not part of the curriculum, they wouldn't take the course. So nobody talks about that kind of thing. Of course, it is very useful to have, for myself as well, how to learn. I mean, I never was taught how to learn. I think, yeah, it's better to add this course actually to the curriculum, learning how to learn. But of course, not at a higher level, maybe in high school, something like that.
Yeah, I hear you. I think there's a lot of frustration sometimes that comes from the question on like, whose responsibility is this? And, don't instructors have enough on their plate? So yeah, I think that's definitely something that like we're somewhat aware of and that we've been thinking about. And I mean, I'm happy to invite like anyone else to respond to that as well. If you think on the same side or any opposing side, like feel free to chime in. But I think I'll go to Sean, your hand next, and then if anyone else has more to add, feel free to also jump in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, I was interested by that question of whose responsibility is it, and whose responsibility it is to talk about like bringing neuroscience into courses and teaching students learning skills. And I was thinking about how Carolyn was pointing out that your approach seems to be heavy on more the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy. And that made me think about the responsibility of the teacher or the instructor, the fact that like it's traditionally in university classrooms, it's always been very heavy on memorization. And now it's considered best practices to focus as well on higher level learning. And so SciLearn seems to be responding to what is actually happening in the classroom, which is that instructors expect a lot of memorization, but maybe what could also be happening or should be happening is that instructors should have less of a focus on memorization, but then that would change the learning skills that students need. But on the other hand, I was thinking about the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and from what I've read about memory, we have limited working memory, and those higher level tasks require that you use that working memory. And if it's all the students' working memory is filled up with the stuff they haven't memorized, they're going to have a harder time on those higher level tasks. So maybe those memorization things are actually still really important to be able to do the higher level tasks. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that I teach biology at McGill as a sessional instructor, and I would love to be involved with your SciLearn initiative. If I'm not exactly sure how to go about that, but I just wanted to put that out there. So if you had some project in mind that you're looking for people, they remember my name.
We will. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That's super exciting. Maybe just anecdotally, I'll add on to that about maybe like what students' needs will be in response to what's happening in classes and with instructors. But I think these modules were designed based on, what we thought was important and students needed. And I actually wasn't part of the design team, so the rest of the SciLearn team is welcome to explain that in more detail if you'd like. But just based on student experiences, I would say a lot of them who typically have been very nervous about things like memory, I heard a lot this year that they were like, yeah, like this seems really like important / useful, but I actually haven't needed to memorize a lot this year because there's no exams anymore, or there's no more, like textbook regurgitation type assessments. So this is great, but I think that a lot of them actually found more benefit in some of the other modules because of the different style of learning that's happened with, this transition to the remote environment. So we also have modules on like flow, like getting into being able to work smoothly in that like productive work zone. We have a module on like aha moments and like kind of realization moments. And there's like little things inserted between all the other modules too on different types of like learning strategies. Study tips, that kind of thing. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to like the SciLearn module design. I think we're also finishing up. I saw Hillary's unmuted, so.
Yeah, sorry, I really don't like interrupting a great discussion like this, but I do have to close the room now that it's 3:30. I'll just remind you all that you can reach out to each other through the conference platform if you're looking for someone's contact information. You can send them a direct chat on the platform or find their information under their profile. So I encourage you to keep up the conversations, and thanks again to our wonderful presenters and our very attentive audience.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.